In 1965, the United States Mint faced one of the most dramatic transitions in modern coinage history. The nation was in the grip of a silver crisis, brought on by rising silver prices and a growing demand for the precious metal. For decades, Washington quarters had been struck in 90% silver, but that year the mint made a critical change, removing silver entirely and introducing a clad composition of copper sandwiched between layers of nickel. This move marked the beginning of a new era for the quarter, but it also created the perfect conditions for errors to creep into production. The presses at Philadelphia churned out hundreds of millions of these new clad quarters, with the Denver Mint producing millions more. It was a time of haste and high pressure at the mint, and under such strain, mistakes were inevitable. Most of the quarters struck in 1965 were flawless examples of the new standard, but a few somehow slipped through carrying remnants of the old silver composition, or struck with misaligned dies, or showing mysterious doubling in the inscriptions. For years, these mistakes lay unnoticed, buried in circulation, indistinguishable to the casual spender. For Michael Foster, a collector who began his hobby as a boy in the 1960s, 1965 quarters were nothing special. He remembered clearly the excitement when news broke that silver would be removed from U.S. coins, and he even kept a few rolls of pre-1965 silver quarters as keepsakes. As time went on, he continued his collecting habit quietly, enjoying the hunt for rare finds among the ordinary. It wasn't until decades later that he stumbled across the coin that would change his perspective on that fateful year's production. He had been sorting through a jar of old change his father had left him, checking dates and mint marks. Most of what he found was unremarkable, well-worn clad quarters, a few tarnished silver dimes, but one coin caught his eye. The quarter, dated 1965, gleamed more brightly than the others, and when he held it to the light, it had the unmistakable white luster of silver. His heart skipped a beat. He weighed it on his old scale, 6.25 grams, the correct weight for a silver quarter, not the lighter clad weight of 5.67 grams. He checked it again, and again, each time the scale confirming what his eyes already knew. At first, Michael couldn't believe it. Surely it was some kind of fluke, he thought. But he dug deeper, consulting reference books and online guides. He learned that a small number of silver planchets, blanks left over from 1964, had accidentally been fed into the presses during the switch to clad in 1965. These rare transitional errors had been quietly entering circulation, unknown to most, but highly prized by error specialists. He sat at his desk for a long time that night, the coin resting in his palm, feeling its cool weight. He marveled at the thought that this tiny disc of metal, overlooked by everyone who'd ever handled it before, carried a mistake that told the story of a chaotic and pivotal moment at the mint. Word of his find spread slowly at first. He took it to a local coin dealer, who confirmed the weight and silver content but offered only a modest sum, suggesting the market for modern errors was unpredictable. Michael declined, deciding instead to send it to a professional grading service. When the coin returned, slabbed and certified as a genuine 1965 silver planchet error, everything changed. Collectors began to take notice. A few similar examples had surfaced over the years, each time drawing more attention, and each sale seemed to set a new benchmark for value. At first, Michael thought perhaps his coin might fetch a few $100, maybe $1,000 if he was lucky. But auction results told a different story. These transitional errors, once considered curiosities, were now seen as important historical artifacts, rare physical evidence of the mint's frantic switch away from silver. The value of his coin began to rise steadily. Collectors recognized not just its rarity, but its symbolism, the last gasp of silver coinage, struck during a year when silver was officially gone. Some viewed it as a mistake, others as a kind of accidental homage to an era that had ended overnight. Prices climbed into the thousands, then tens of thousands as demand surged. The error itself was simple yet striking. The coin bore all the features of the new clad quarters, the 1965 date, the lack of mint mark indicating Philadelphia, but its metal was pure silver, its luster unmistakable. To the untrained eye it might look like any other old quarter, but in the hands of a collector it revealed its secret with an undeniable brilliance. And then came an unexpected twist. As Michael followed the growing market for 1965 silver errors, he learned that not all of them were exactly alike. Some had been struck slightly off-center, some showed doubling on the obverse lettering, and others bore faint die cracks, making each unique. His coin, it turned out, had a very faint but visible die clash on the reverse, where an outline of Washington's profile could just barely be seen behind the eagle. This tiny additional flaw, likely caused when the dies struck each other without a planchet in place, made his coin even more fascinating to specialists. By the time he finally decided to sell, the market had grown red hot. Collectors and investors alike were competing for every known example of the 1965 silver quarter, each auction bringing higher bids than the last. The auction house described Michael's coin in glowing terms, emphasizing not just its transitional error status but also the unique die clash feature that set it apart from its peers. On the night of the sale, Michael watched from the back of the room as bidding began. Hands shot up quickly, the numbers rising with each call. The final price stunned even the auctioneer, settling somewhere between $30,000 and $88,000, an astonishing sum for what once was simply a penny's worth of silver in a sea of clad coins. The 1965 Washington quarter had begun life as a mistake, a forgotten silver blank lost in the chaos of change, and ended its journey as a prized piece of history, a shining reminder that even the smallest details can carry the greatest significance. In 1982, the United States Mint was grappling with mounting production costs and a restless public. Inflation was high, budgets were tight, and the Treasury sought ways to cut expenses wherever possible. That year the Mint made the controversial decision to stop producing proof sets for collectors, saving money but disappointing many numismatists who eagerly awaited them each year. Meanwhile, the presses in Philadelphia and Denver continued churning out circulation coins at a furious pace to keep up with demand, including hundreds of millions of Washington quarters. These 1982 quarters seemed, at first glance, unremarkable. They carried the familiar portrait of George Washington on the obverse and the proud eagle on the reverse. But subtle changes were taking place behind the scenes. Rising costs of planchets and constant die wear from overuse began to take their toll, and quality control began slipping in ways that no one at the time fully appreciated. The Mint, under pressure to keep up production, had little time to slow down for minor irregularities. But those irregularities soon gave rise to some of the most intriguing errors of the era. It would take years before collectors realized what they were holding in their hands. For years Tom Callahan, a lifelong collector, had made it a ritual to stop by his bank every Friday and pick up a few rolls of quarters. Most weekends yielded nothing more than well-worn clad coins, but he enjoyed the hunt, the small chance that something rare might emerge. One Friday afternoon in the early 2000s, Tom opened yet another roll and began checking dates one by one. The familiar clink of quarters on his desk was soothing and predictable, until he noticed something that wasn't that. He picked up a 1982 P quarter and stopped. The coin looked strange under the light, almost ghostly in its appearance. The inscriptions on the obverse seemed faint, weakly struck. The reverse eagle, normally bold and crisp, appeared flat and ill-defined. It wasn't just wear, the coin was in otherwise excellent condition, yet the details seemed washed out. Curious, Tom weighed the coin. The scale showed a reading slightly lower than expected for a standard clad quarter. His pulse quickened. He turned to his reference books and learned about a phenomenon he had never fully appreciated before, the so-called weak strike or improperly prepared planchet errors that plagued certain issues in the early 1980s. As he read, he discovered that 1982 was a particularly notorious year. The Mint's cost-cutting measures had resulted in planchets that were not properly annealed, leaving them too hard for the dies to strike fully. This led to quarters that left the presses with blurry details and poor definition, many of which slipped unnoticed into circulation. Further complicating matters was that 1982 marked the first year the Mint decided to stop stamping mint marks on Philadelphia coins, making attribution more difficult and adding to the confusion. Tom spent weeks poring through his rolls, pulling every 1982 quarter he could find and examining them under magnification. Many were worn beyond recognition, but a few stood out as having the same ghostly weakness as his first discovery. He even found one struck slightly off-center, with an oddly wide rim on one side, a further hint of the Mint's hurried, flawed production. At first he thought little of their value. After all, they were still clad quarters, struck in nickel and copper, with no precious metal content to drive up prices. But then he stumbled across auction records showing that collectors of modern eras were beginning to pay serious premiums for high-grade examples of these weak-strike 1982 quarters. Some examples, he learned, had already sold for thousands of dollars, with prices continuing to climb as more people became aware of their rarity. What fascinated Tom even more was how few collectors at the time had cared enough to preserve 1982 quarters in high grade. Because the mint didn't issue proof sets or uncirculated mint sets that year, the only way to find them was to pluck them straight from circulation, and most people simply spent them without a second thought. That scarcity of pristine examples made his own discoveries all the more exciting. In the months that followed, Tom's coins drew attention from dealers and collectors alike. The weak strikes, once dismissed as minor flaws, were now seen as historical artifacts of a difficult year at the mint, proof of the compromises made under economic pressure. His best example, graded and certified by a top-tier service, attracted considerable buzz at a major coin show, but just when he thought he understood the story of his 1982 quarters, Tom was in for an even bigger surprise. During a quiet afternoon at another coin shop, he overheard two dealers discussing a rumored handful of 1982 quarters struck on experimental planchets. Planchets that were slightly lighter, with a noticeably different tone under certain lighting. These ultra-rare transitional errors, it turned out, had been struck during testing of new alloys, and a few had accidentally been mixed into production. Only a handful were known, and they commanded staggering premiums whenever one appeared. Tom went home that evening and retrieved his rolls again. Under a stronger light, he re-examined every one of his weak-strike quarters, testing their weight on his scale. To his astonishment, one coin registered an even lower weight than the others, just shy of standard specifications. Its surfaces also displayed a slightly different sheen, almost as if it had a faint golden undertone. It took months of research and verification, but Tom finally confirmed that his find was one of those experimental alloy errors, a coin so rare and mysterious that even seasoned experts debated how many existed. When he finally decided to consign his collection to auction, the buzz was electric. The auctioneer praised his coins as among the finest and most intriguing examples of the 1982 errors to surface in years. Bidding was fierce, with collectors vying for the chance to own a piece of modern numismatic history. When the hammer fell, the final combined price stunned even Tom. His 1982 era quarters sold for a total in the range of $30,000 to $88,000, cementing their place as a testament to how a moment of compromise at the mint could yield an enduring and valuable treasure for those who cared enough to look closely. In 1985, the United States Mint found itself at a crossroads of tradition and efficiency. The Washington quarter, which had been a mainstay of American pocket change since 1932, continued to roll off the presses in staggering numbers, meeting the ever-growing needs of commerce. That year alone, the Philadelphia and Denver mints struck over 1.2 billion quarters combined, ensuring that every cash register and vending machine in the country stayed fed. Yet behind those numbers lay subtle, nearly invisible cracks in the mint's operations, cracks that manifested in ways no one on the production floor could have predicted. By the mid-1980s, the mint had long since transitioned away from silver to copper-nickel clad planchets, a change made 2 decades earlier to save costs. But the unrelenting pace of production, coupled with aging equipment and overused dies, led to a growing number of minor irregularities slipping into circulation. To most people these were little more than curiosities, soft rims, slightly rotated dies, or faintly doubled letters, but to sharp-eyed collectors they were the start of something worth paying attention to. One collector in particular, Emily Vargas, had been hunting through rolls of coins since childhood. She had grown up fascinated by the idea that something extraordinary could hide in plain sight. On a chilly autumn afternoon in 2001, Emily picked up 2 rolls of quarters at her local bank and sat down at her kitchen table, expecting nothing more than another quiet evening of sorting. She spread the coins across a white cloth, a habit she developed to spot subtle differences more easily. One by one, she examined each date, mint mark, and strike quality, and then she paused. In her hand was a 1985 P quarter that just felt different. At first she couldn't pinpoint why. It gleamed under the light but looked almost unfinished. The details on Washington's profile seemed weak, his hair blending into the fields of the coin, while the eagle on the reverse lacked its usual sharpness. The coin was otherwise lustrous and uncirculated, so where wasn't to blame? Intrigued, Emily set it aside and kept looking. A few coins later, she found another. Then another. Each bore the same strange, blurry features, and each weighed just a hair less than standard. Something unusual had clearly happened to a small batch of 1985 quarters, though no record of such an error appeared in her well-worn reference guides. Over the next several months Emily scoured coin shows, auctions, and online forums, seeking any mention of this oddity. Slowly a picture emerged. During 1985 the Philadelphia Mint experienced multiple die failures and planchet inconsistencies thanks to overworked equipment and loose quality controls. Some quarters were struck on improperly annealed planchets, which left them harder than usual and resistant to a full strike. Others, it turned out, were struck slightly off-center or with tilted dies, producing uneven rims and ghost-like details. As word of these errors spread among collectors, demand began to build. For decades, clad quarters had been largely ignored by the hobby's old guard, dismissed as too common and too new to merit serious interest. But the tide was turning. A younger generation of collectors, raised on pocket change rather than silver dollars, began to chase modern errors with enthusiasm, and prices started to reflect that change. Emily watched with quiet satisfaction as similar examples to hers began to appear in auctions and private sales, their prices creeping higher each year. What once might have fetched a small premium now brought hundreds of dollars. Graded and certified pieces in particularly high condition even began flirting with four figures, and whispers at coin shows suggested that the market was far from reaching its ceiling. But Emily wasn't finished yet. One day while examining yet another roll of quarters, she came across a coin that stopped her cold. At first glance it seemed like her other finds: soft strike, uneven rims, faint lettering. But something about it was even more dramatic, and when she weighed it she nearly dropped her scale. The coin came in significantly underweight. Her heart raced as she flipped through her notes and checked her resources. What she held was one of the exceedingly rare transitional error quarters, struck on a planchet intended for another denomination altogether. Further examination under a microscope revealed telltale characteristics: the edges were slightly beveled, and faint traces of an incorrect copper core could be detected under the nickel plating. The revelation left her stunned. She sent her find to a respected grading service, which confirmed her suspicion and certified the coin as a unique transitional error. The news rippled through the collector community, and word of Emily's discovery made it into several numismatic journals and newsletters. As the years passed, the value of her collection continued to grow. The growing interest in modern errors, combined with the extreme scarcity of high-grade 1985 weak strikes and transitional planchets, pushed auction prices higher and higher. Emily finally decided to consign her best examples to a major auction house, where they were prominently featured in a catalog of rare errors. The bidding was heated and emotional. Collectors who had once scoffed at clad quarters now fought tooth and nail to own a piece of this quiet, overlooked chapter of mint history. The final hammer price of Emily's group stunned even the auctioneer, landing firmly in the range of $32,000 to $85,000. As the room quieted and her coins were carried away to their new owners, Emily couldn't help but smile. The coins she'd rescued from obscurity decades earlier had finally claimed their rightful place in the spotlight, proof that even in the most ordinary of places, something truly extraordinary can sometimes be found.